Thank you very much, Tal. Madam Ora Goldenberg, it's a real honour and a pleasure to have you with us tonight. Professor Nelly Cohen, Professor Yoav Hennis, Dean Ron Harris, Professor Michael Bienhak, and Mr. Tal Band, of course, and the very many distinguished guests that are here tonight. I thank you for joining us. It's first of all a really great pleasure for me to be in Israel once again, and it's a particular honour to be here for the inauguration of the S. Horowitz Institute for Intellectual Property in memory of Dr. Amnon Goldenberg. Please allow me to join others in celebrating the many achievements, the great dedication, the high professionalism, the legal scholarship, the qualities as a gentleman and his integrity of Dr. Amnon Goldenberg. I'm really humbled to participate in the inauguration of this institute in his memory. And I'm delighted that you're here tonight, Madam Ora Goldenberg. I'd like to also take the opportunity to wish much success to the new institute. Jewish, I think, in general, and Israeli in particular, scholarship is legendary, and I think it's also legendary in the field of intellectual property, not surprisingly, since I believe that intellectual property ultimately is not a narrow, specialized, technical specialization, but it is really about the whole manner in which knowledge and culture are produced, distributed, and consumed in society and in the economy. And there is no people that has been closer to that process, I think, than the Jewish people and the Israelis. So I'm sure that the new institute will have a very bright future in front of it and will quickly establish itself as one of the centres of intellectual property research in the world. I wanted to talk to you tonight about a subject that I believe is of fundamental importance to our world, and in particular to knowledge and culture, and that is copyright policy in the global digital content marketplace. It's a subject that I've been thinking about for some time now, but despite that, I'm not sure that I think that I understand it yet. So I hope that you will forgive me for some of the raw reflections or the raw state of some of my reflections. But when one looks at the world of copyright, I think that we see, of course, enormous change and a great deal of activity. There's a multiplicity of agendas. Those agendas exist at the national level, they exist at the bilateral level, they exist at the plurilateral level, at the regional level, and they exist also at the multilateral level. But I think that they are all ultimately connected, and if not, perhaps not explicitly, perhaps not even politically, but I think in the long term, historically. And the connection between all those agendas, I think, is that they are all instances of adaptations or coming to terms with the growing reality of a global digital content market. And I think that that perspective is a useful perspective to use to understand the many developments that seemingly otherwise are unconnected in the field of copyright. So they're all instances, I think, of the adaptation of the laws, the institutions, the economic agents or market actors, and the public, the adaptation of the architecture of the analogue and territorial world to the reality of a global digital content marketplace. These adaptations are, of course, inherently complex in themselves, but they're further complicated, I think, by two factors or two contexts. The first of those is the social context, namely that the digital revolution constitutes the greatest democratization of knowledge and culture that we have seen for 6 centuries, in fact, since the invention, of course, of printing or movable type. And secondly, because the second complicating factor, I think, is the politics of intellectual property. And in many respects, I think the politics of intellectual property, internationally at any rate, are still stuck in an economic model of the 1970s and no longer necessarily correspond to the economic reality of today. Now let me try to unpick that and to make it a little bit more concrete and a little less abstract. As you're all very aware, I think, there are two fundamental changes in technology, in the technology of culture, or less grandly, the technology of creative works that have taken place. The first, of course, is digital technology, the transition from analog to digital, which brought with it the challenge of reproducibility and the disjunction between the cost of production and the cost of reproduction. Take a film, for example. The cost of the production of a film might be many hundreds of millions of dollars. It might involve hundreds of persons, and it can all be reproduced in a matter of seconds. The second, besides reproducibility, is, of course, the internet, which has revolutionized distribution and which has brought with it the challenge of escapability or non-containability. So not only can a work be reproduced for nothing now, but it can also be made available or accessed in any place on the globe. And these are the two problems, I think, that copyright policy has mainly confronted in the course of the last 20 years. And they are also the problems with which all laws, institutions, economic agents, and the public, I think, have been grappling. Now, that process of coming to terms with these two technological realities, I think, has seen, broadly speaking, three phases, and I hope very much a fourth phase, which is the global digital content marketplace. The first phase, as you're all aware, was the appearance of illegal content, if you'll excuse me just using shorthand for it, illegal content on the internet. And it was a phase which was characterized really by fear and resistance on the part of all of the actors in the analog world. Because of bandwidth limitations and the absence of any developed interfaces for other content such as books, Kindle and other e-readers had not yet been invented, the music industry was the one that was on the front line during this first phase. MP3 was developed, you will remember, and Napster and other peer-to-peer file-sharing networks came about. At that stage, there was no legal repertoire online. During that phase, we did have an international response, and that was the two copyright treaties that were concluded in 1996, the WIPO Copyright Treaty and the WIPO Performances and Phonograms Treaty. And it was an early adaptation, and it introduced, as you're all aware, the right of communication or making available, technological protection measures, and digital rights management protection. And those two treaties were in turn translated into national laws. For example, the Digital Copyright Millennium Act of the year 2000 of the United States of America. But they were based very much on analogies with the analog world. They were based on the notion of the containability of a work. This was the idea of technological measures of protection, and this was the idea of rights management, of course. For various reasons, which I won't go into here, those two treaties updated most but not all of the international framework for copyright. The two areas which were omitted were audiovisual performances and broadcasting. I think from that phase we passed in, largely as a result of Apple and the iPod, passed into a second phase, which was the appearance of legal content on the internet. And the analogy, I think, to the analog world still prevailed. So songs were treated as commodities, and very much it was a model of ownership of content. We all know that actually you don't own content, you licensed it, but the idea was ownership of content. There were some differences. There were no longer LPs or long-playing records. because there was no constraint imposed by a physical container, and there was portability, space shifting, as we say. But we saw during this phase that repertoires started to come online, and digital sales began. And I think we also saw born the subversive thought that facility of access, measured in terms of cost and ease of access, might determine the level of legality or compliance that one might expect from the marketplace. Internationally, during this period, we continued to struggle with the gaps that had been left by the 1996 treaties, namely audiovisual performances and broadcasting, but not much progress was made. I think we then entered into a third phase, which is the phase that I think we probably still are in, where we moved from doing analogies to the analogue world for the production and distribution and consumption of content or creative works to a new model, not of ownership, but of access. And this is the models that we now see, particularly in music, of streaming and subscription, but also in the publishing industry, since there are now a number of publishing or companies that offer access to published works as on a subscription basis, rather than offering to sell individual items of work. You will get access for a fee to the whole of literature, and you can use any 5 books at any given stage during the period of your subscription. As a result of that, I think, we saw that digital revenues rose very much. The number of subscribers to subscription services has increased dramatically in the course of the last 3 years. There is now, for example, about 40 million songs online legally. And meanwhile, in terms of the international framework, we were able to solve during this period the audiovisual gap with the Beijing Treaty on the protection of audiovisual performances. Now, if I may, I'll go back to the legal framework and to the multilateral attempts to deal with the questions of reproducibility and escapability. Somewhat independently of the movement of technology and these two questions, I think over this period also a new agenda was born internationally, and that was the agenda of exceptions and limitations. International treaties for exceptions and limitations in the field of copyright. I say somewhat independently, but of course they are concerned with the fundamental question of access, and so they might be considered to be also very much linked with these technological developments. Of course, behind this movement, I think, lie a great many different ways of looking at the copyright system. For some, it was an attempt, as they say, to rebalance the international copyright system. For others, it was the notion of access to knowledge. For others, it was the notion of information should be free. For some others, it was a response to what was perceived as the overly restrictive measures in the field of intellectual property of the TRIPS agreement or bilateral free trade agreements. And we're still in the middle of this, but I would suggest that this agenda of exceptions and limitations is a very good illustration of the fact that what we are really contending with is the growing reality of a global, legal, digital content marketplace. Now, the first fruit of that particular agenda was the Marrakesh Treaty to improve access, to facilitate access to published works for persons who are blind, visually impaired, or otherwise print disabled. It did two things. It internationalized the exception to copyright that exists in many, many national laws, which enables copyright to be broken for the purpose of creating a work in an accessible format such as Braille or indeed an audio tape for persons who are visually impaired. And secondly, and perhaps more importantly, it facilitated the cross-border exchange of works in accessible formats. In other words, it made the national exceptions talk to each other. It was, however, extremely difficult to conclude that treaty, even though one might think that from a humanitarian point of view, it's a treaty which was obvious. It was difficult, however, because of fear of the broader agenda of rebalancing the international copyright system, because of fear on the part of the publishers of the loss or escapability of the underlying digital master files that would constitute the works in accessible formats. But in the end, good sense prevailed, and we were able to conclude a treaty that I think left everyone in the unusual position of being happy. Usually a good result internationally is when everyone is equally unhappy. In this instance, I think we had a good result with everyone equally happy. But the result, of course, created expectations on the part of the developing countries that this was an agenda that was moving. It also created fear on the part of the content-owning countries that, well, doing a treaty for the blind and for visually impaired persons was one thing, but that was where it should stop in the view of many others. Now, the other items that are left on the agenda internationally in the exceptions and limitations are, first of all, libraries and archives. Now, the library, of course, is a venerated institution. It has been with us since the foundation of the Library of Alexandria, and it has been, by and large, an extremely successful institution. But I don't think that this question of an exception and limitation for libraries and archives at the international level is really about a technical matter. It's really about, if one looks at it in the context of the global digital content marketplace, the exchange of works internationally, it's really about what is the position of the library in the contemporary world, and will the library indeed survive? Now, in itself, the question has some value. An average good research university will probably spend about 30 million each year for materials that it licenses in terms of publications, a large component of which will be electronic materials these days. But I think the real question that lies behind this is, if we take the example of the British Library, for example, can the British Library lend to Israelis? Can the British Library lend to Australians? Can it lend to Botswanans? Of course, technologically it can now, because they're dealing with e-files. And so the question of exceptions and limitations, born of an agenda really relating to rebalancing, I think, the international patent, the international copyright system, has a much greater significance when looked at from the perspective of the global digital content marketplace, or the global marketplace for the exchange of content and materials. Excuse me. And there are many interesting questions there, many interesting technical questions, but when you've answered all of those, I think you're also left with the question of, is Google a library? Google's mission in life is to organise all the world's knowledge and to make it available. So is it a library? Is it entitled to the exception like everyone else? Then you can move to the next one, which is education. The next exception, which is sought internationally by way of some normative instrument. And when you look at education, of course, it's, again, a field of high value. In terms of value, I think my figures are perhaps a year or two old, but the market internationally for publishing materials is about $150 billion, and 34% of that is educational materials. If you compare it to other areas of content, publications, for example, is a market which is bigger than music. It's bigger than films. Films is about $135 billion worldwide. So huge economic interests are at stake. And I think all of the same questions arise that we see in relation to libraries and archives, which are really provoked by the perspective of a global digital content marketplace. So, who is a beneficiary here? What is an educational institution? Are any of the stock exchange quoted companies that are providing services for educational materials, of which there are many? Are they educational institutions which would be entitled to an exception? And perhaps most importantly of all, there is, to some extent internationally, a mismatch of expectations in relation to what this particular exception would achieve. For some developing countries, the purpose of the exception would be no copyright or free textbooks because of the perceived problem of the high cost of textbooks. For some of the developed countries and the content-producing countries, however, the question is really about a limited exception that exists for certain educational uses, such as the use of paragraphs and different components of materials in the context of education and teaching, and this in a context in which educational materials are increasingly moving from physical text to electronic and digital platforms and delivery systems. So I think, excuse me, you have there a similar set of questions that are really provoked not by the exception itself, but by the fact that we are moving inexorably to a global digital content marketplace as a consequence of the underlying technology. Let me touch briefly on broadcasting, which is another item on the international agenda and which, as I mentioned, is one of the areas in the international architecture that was not updated in 1996 by the two treaties that were then concluded. This has been a long-standing project. In fact, one of the delegates said that when he attended the first meeting on broadcasting at WIPO, his first child was born, and that child is now 21 years of age, and we're still discussing the project. But in that time of 21 years, the technology, of course, has completely changed. We no longer really have televisions. You know, we do have televisions, but as they say, broadcasting has become platform agnostic. You receive broadcasting and broadcasts and television on any sort of a platform, including your mobile telephone. So it has completely changed. Large economic interests are at stake. It is the principal means for financing sport around the world, whether Olympic sport or football or any of the other sports. But I think you have all the same questions now arising in relation to broadcasting that we see in relation to exceptions and limitations, namely, who is a broadcaster now? Is YouTube a broadcaster? Is a YouTube user a broadcaster? Someone who puts content on the internet? Are they a broadcaster? And what is a broadcast? Is it something that is transmitted over the air, which is the current approach that is adopted, or is it something that can be transmitted exclusively digitally? So, I will return now to the question of the evolution of the digital revolution and my suggestion that the perspective from which we should analyse this increasingly is the reality of a global digital content marketplace. Here, I think we must acknowledge that this global digital content marketplace is a technological reality, a technological possibility, and we must acknowledge also that business models are increasingly addressing the fact that this is a technological reality. But I don't think we all have the conscious policy orientation of addressing these copyright questions in this manner. And I think it would be useful if you were to take the field of broadcasting, for example, and you analyse the economics of broadcasting, you see that actually broadcasting is rather stagnant in all of the developed countries. The growth in broadcasting is in the developing countries, in the emerging countries. But the demandeurs, the proponents of the broadcasting treaty, are actually the developed countries. And the resistors, to some extent, have been the developing countries. It's an example of a disjunction between the political positions and the underlying economic reality. I think to some extent we do see a conscious approach on the part of policymakers and legislators around the world to deal with the reality of a global market. An example of that, I think, would be the injunction that exists as a possibility in some 32 countries now to stop an ISP from giving access to an overseas website which is deemed to be a pirate website. That is dealing with the reality that exchange is global, that it's no longer a national question. So I think we do see some endeavours on the part of policymakers to start to address the reality of the global marketplace. But there are many, many questions that are still outstanding. For example, the question of safe harbour, which was a possibility that was raised initially in the context of the digital revolution. Who is an internet service provider? It was safe harbour was a provision in American and European laws giving the possibility of a safe harbour to internet service providers for the distribution of allegedly infringing content, copyright content. But who is a content distributor now? Is Google, is YouTube an internet service provider? It does claim the safe harbour exception right now. Many in the content producing industries feel that Google and YouTube and other distributors should not have the benefit of the safe harbour provisions because they are really distributors of content and they're not merely conduits by which traffic on the internet pass or through which traffic on the internet pass. Another major question, I think, is the value chain that we now have for content globally. The value chain from creator or author to performer to distributor and to consumer. We see this playing out. We see it playing out in the popular press with Taylor Swift saying that she will withdraw her content from Spotify because artists are not receiving sufficient distribution of the royalties for content. We see it with the development by Jay-Z and others of their own platform for the distribution of content in order to favour artists. And we see also that at the same time Spotify, Deezer, Apple Music, Google, Amazon, Netflix, not to mention the Chinese, big Chinese distributors of content, all are platforms in which there is huge investment but very little profit. So the whole value chain, I think, for the distribution of content needs to be examined, and it would be a good question for the new institute. I think another question that we must ask is whether the basic concepts that were laid down in the 1996 treaties, the WIPO Copyright Treaty and the WIPO Performances and Phonograms Treaty, were right. Whether the right of making available is the appropriate way to address the question, or whether equitable remuneration might be a better way of addressing the question, and this is one question that is currently extremely contentious in Europe. And it brings about, I think, a broader question, which is the question of agile norm-making, as Klaus Schwab would call it. Treaties, like laws to some extent, are not really revised. Once they're there, that's it. So in this very fast-moving world, is it possible to conceive of a rule-making activity which is much more agile and much more able to adapt to constantly changing realities? I think a further question that we have to ask also is that markets, of course, obviously are made by economic agents and not by governments. So what is the role of governments in this new emerging global digital content marketplace? And in particular, what role is there for competition law? Competition law, of course, is not international. It's wholly national or regional. So is there a role for a competition law with respect to this marketplace, which is one of the classical instruments that one would apply from a public policy point of view to a marketplace. We should remember also that ultimately it is a market of data. What is bought and sold, exchanged, is data, in fact. Data are indeed the physical support that we had in the analogue world through records, CDs, DVDs, and so forth. And that brings with it a whole host of questions such as standards, interoperability of data, licensing, whether we can develop an efficient global licensing mechanism. Some now consider that blockchain may be the answer to this form of licensing. What is the role for norms in this? And is there a role for a global repertoire or database? Two other points then, and I shall stop, are I think that by nature, this marketplace being global is going to require multi-sectoral cooperation. It's going to require multi-stakeholder involvement. It is not something that obviously can be constructed by governments. It is being constructed, as a matter of fact, by the business response to the technological realities. And the role for governments and the role also for intergovernmental organisations in this context is a very different one. I sometimes think that it's rather unflattering, but I'll nevertheless say it, that it's not possible for international cooperation, given the asymmetries that exist in the world and the deep divergences that exist in the world. It's not possible for international organisations to be at the cutting edge. Their role increasingly is confined to mopping up or consolidating what has emerged as the best practices of the marketplace 20 years ago. That's not necessarily a role without value, by the way. Someone has to do it, and the floor has to be slowly raised. But if you look at the cutting edge is actually in the marketplace. It's the marketplace that is developing the models in response to the technological possibilities. And then we have, I think, as policymakers, the very important task of trying to sort all of that out after the fact, try to establish the best practices, and try to ensure that the original balances built into the copyright system between incentivising, on the one hand, producers of content or creators, and on the other hand, ensuring the widest possible distribution of creative works, are retained in this world of emerging business models which are developed in response to the technological possibilities. And finally, I would say we have a major question to address in terms of architecture. The architecture that we now have, of course, for the distribution of copyright works is very much an analogue world architecture. I'm speaking here of collective management organisations, for example. How will they adapt, and how are they adapting to the reality of this global digital content marketplace? And should this be left simply to the process of creative destruction of the marketplace, or should there be some form of guidance provided by the public sector? So thank you very much for this opportunity to be with you tonight and to speak about this subject. Thank you.